Today I'll be doing Duke. So first I'll talk a little bit about the head coach, and then I'll talk some about the roster, and then I'll go through the schedule game by game and give you a predicted winner and loser for each game. So head coach Manny Diaz enters his first season as the head coach of Duke, and his fourth season as a head coach. He was the head coach at Miami for 3 seasons from 2019 to 2021, and he got fired from there after a 21-15 record. And I think that he's not a very good head coach right now. But what I do think he's good at is a defensive play calling. He was the defensive coordinator at Penn State for these past 2 seasons and did an amazing job with their defense. So recruiting this year at Duke was very bad. They only ranked at 61st in recruiting, and I do think that Diaz is a clear downgrade from Mike Elko as a head coach. So now, starting on the offensive side of the roster at quarterback, I know it's not good losing Riley Leonard. He was a good quarterback for Duke, but you do have to remember that he was only healthy for 5 games last season. So I am high on the transfer quarterback they brought in, Malik Murphy from Texas. He has a lot of talent, and he throws a good deep ball. And he started 2 games at quarterback for Texas last year when Quinn Ewers was hurt, and they did win both of those games. So he threw 62 passes in those 2 games combined, and he does need to work on his accuracy, and his yards per throw average was not that good last year in those 2 games. It was at 6.7, and he only completed 56.4% of his passes in those 2 games. But he did throw for 418 and 3 touchdowns combined in those 2 games. But the coaching at Duke is not going to be near as good as it would have been at Texas. So at wide receiver, they do have one good receiver coming back, Jordan Moore, who had last season 835 on 62 catches and 8 touchdowns, averaging 13.5 a catch. But they don't really have any other good receivers, and he's going to need some help. So at running back, they do lose their top running back, Jordan Waters, who is transferred to one of their in-state rivals, NC State. But they do have Jaquez Moore coming back, who is also a good running back. He had last season 674 on 116 carries and 6 touchdowns, averaging 5.8 a carry. And he had 2 games of 100 plus rushing yards last season. And they do bring in 2 other transfer running backs that I'm sure will play quite a bit and help them out. So the offensive line, though, is going to be a problem, I think, for Duke. I think this is going to make their offense struggle this year. So they only have 2 starters coming back on the offensive line, and the other 3 starters will be transfers, but they're not very talented. And I heard that their offensive line really looked like a problem in the spring. And when your line struggles, your offense usually struggles. So on the defensive side, I think they'll be solid here. Not quite as good as last year, but with a defensive head coach, you would expect them to be okay. So on the defensive line, I think they're going to take a step back here from where they were last year. They don't have any starters coming back, but they do have Wesley Williams, who did play in every game and looked good. He had 39 tackles and 1.5 sacks and 5 total pressures and a pass breakup last season. And they bring in a transfer from Liberty, Kendi Charles, who had in 21 games at these past 2 seasons, 86 tackles, 8.5 sacks, and 14 total pressures, and a forced fumble and a fumble recovery. So they should be okay on the defensive line, but not good. And at linebacker in the secondary, Duke does look pretty good. So at linebacker, they returned Trey Freeman, who was their leading tackler last season, probably the best player on their defense. He had 106 tackles and three pass breakups and eight total pressures and one and a half sacks and a forced fumble and an interception. And they have Nick Morris coming back, who had last season 61 tackles and a sack and a fumble recovery. And he only started 5 games last season. And they bring in a transfer linebacker from the FCS level, coming from Princeton, Uzi Nicholas, who had last season 104 tackles and four and a half sacks and three pass breakups and a forced fumble and fumble recovery. Now, some of these FCS transfers don't work out at the Power Four level, but there are quite a few FCS transfers that are good at that level that do adjust well to the Power Four level. So, uh, and the secondary at safety, they get both starters back who are good. They get back Jalen Stinson, who had last season 88 tackles and six pass breakups and an interception and a fumble recovery and a sack. And they have Trey Moore, who had 43 tackles and two and a half sacks and five total pressures and two pass breakups in 12 games last season. And then at cornerback, they returned Chandler Rivers, who is a good player. He had last season 58 tackles and a defensive touchdown and seven pass breakups and a quarterback pressure. And then they bring in a transfer cornerback from Rice, Trishawn Devons, who had last season 45 tackles and 11 pass breakups and two interceptions and a fumble recovery. And then on special teams, they are going to have a new punter this year, but they return their kicker, who is solid. So now moving on to the predictions, they start the year against some team called Elon. This will be an easy win, and then they play on the road at Northwestern. So I know both teams were pretty similar last year, and because at Northwestern returns a lot more players and their head coach, they're expected to be better than Duke this year. But I don't really think they are. Duke, I think, still has more talent on their roster, but I am picking Northwestern to win a close one because they do have home field advantage. And Connecticut next. This should be a pretty easy win. It might not be a blowout, but they should win it by three scores. Then on the road at Middle Tennessee, this isn't a guaranteed win for Duke. I think that this won't be a blowout, but I do think they still have enough to win this game. Then they play North Carolina at home. So, like I said in the North Carolina video, North Carolina does have more talent on their roster than Duke does, but I don't trust North Carolina to win all of these games against teams that they're more talented than, because they never seem to do it. And with this game being at Duke, I think they pull off a really close upset win. So then they play on the road at Georgia Tech. I think this will be a loss. Probably will be a pretty close game, but Duke, I do think it may have a little better defense than Georgia Tech does. Georgia Tech is going to struggle in the front seven, but Georgia Tech, I think, has a much better offense than Duke does, and they'll be able to score quite a bit on Duke, even though Duke will probably have a decent defense. And uh, I think that Duke won't be able to outscore them. They won't have enough offense. Then they play Florida State on a Friday, probably a Friday night game at home after getting a week off. There won't be an upset in this one, I don't think. I think Florida State is just too talented. Now, I do think it'll probably be competitive, but I do think Florida State will win by a couple of scores. Even though I'm not real high on Florida State, I do like they're coached much better. Then they play SMU at home. I had a tough time with this one. SMU though, I think is for sure ready to make the move to the Power Four with all of the Power Four transfers they've got on their roster, and I think they're going to be a pretty good team this year. I think they're going to be able to beat a team like Duke, but this is one that Duke could get. It'll probably be pretty close. Then on the road at Miami, I think this will be a blowout loss for Duke. Miami is going to have so much offense this year. I think it's going to be hard for anyone to stop them. And I think Duke is still going to give up a lot of points to Miami. And I don't think Duke will be able to score much in this game because Miami's defensive line being so good, I think will dominate the Duke offensive line and shut down Duke's offense. So then they play on the road at NC State. So not a huge talent advantage in this game for NC State, in my opinion. But I do think they clearly do have a better roster, and I like the coaching a lot better at NC State than I do at Duke right now. So I think it'll be pretty close, but I've got to go with NC State. Then they play Virginia Tech at home after getting a week off. So I said in the Virginia Tech video that I am high on them, but I don't think that they're talented enough to play consistently good every Saturday, and I think it will cost them a game this year, being inconsistent most likely, and I think this is it. Duke, I think, pulls off a really close upset win. Then they end the season on the road at Wake Forest. I had a tough time with this one because even though I think Duke still is a better team than Wake Forest is horrible. It's on the road, but I do think Duke still has enough on their roster to get this win in a close one. My final prediction for Duke is 6-6 overall and 3-5 in the conference. So I have them getting back to a bowl game, and you can get mad and type in the comments that I'm an idiot that hates Duke, but I think I'm being very fair to them. I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt on a few of these games, uh, and this is only a one game difference than their record last year in the regular season. They were 7-5. I am higher on them than the other magazines are. Like Phil Steele's magazine has Duke as being the worst team in the ACC, and the ACC is a horrible conference, So that means that Duke is expected to be pretty bad. But that will be it with this video, and please subscribe, and thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon.